All right, so I have the easy topic of reviewing all of the currently commercially available filter devices. So, I'll go through basically a little bit of a history of filters, and then we'll talk about what's available and what's not, and then what's coming. These are my disclosures. So the concept of vena cava interruption is obviously not new. This is something that's been talked about and been done for a long time. Interestingly, the filter code that we use was based on vena cava interruption, which is a surgical code, which is definitely why the reimbursement was so high initially when filters were placed, because it was based on a surgical reimbursement code. I think we went over this a little bit, but where do filters fit in within the PE algorithm? Some would agree that this is where we should put it, but recurrent PE despite therapy is probably one of the indications. And I listed the absolute indications for filters that I consider absolute, and this is based on recommendations: recurrent venous thromboembolism despite anticoagulation, contraindication anticoagulation, and then a complication that happened because of anticoagulation, or inability to be therapeutic. There's obviously a lot of relative contraindications as well, and this is where we don't really have a lot of data. And we've talked about a lot of these indications, but I would emphasize and I would suggest to you that if you are going to put one in for these indications, you need to be even more aggressive about getting the filter out when it's not needed anymore, because a lot of these indications are temporary. Also prophylactic. This comes up later when we talk about what's coming out in the future, but trauma patients that have high risk, surgical procedures at high risk, or medical conditions with high risk. These are conditions with very little data, and also the ones where we tend to forget that the patient has a filter. And most of the filters that we remove or have complications are in these types of patients where filters are forgotten. Obviously, there's some contraindications if you don't have an approach, hypercoagulopathy, systemic fibrinolysis, or megacave, although you could use a bird's nest. I don't even know if the bird's nest is still available. I think it might be. I do have an expired one, but that's about it. Briefly, IVC interruption first occurred in 1943. Dr. Oshner and Dr. DeBakey, that's the DeWeese clip that you see on the image on the right. That's IVC plication, which was done in 1959. And then obviously we know about the Moben-Uden filter, which I've never seen. Has anybody seen one of those? I don't know if the patients are still alive that have them anymore, but I haven't seen them at all. Obviously we see Greenfield, but not typically the original Greenfield, which was 1973. Typically we see the ones that are more recent. The Moben-Uden filter had a 60% IVC thrombosis rate. But this is really, it's interesting because the concept is very similar to what we've seen in some of the newer designs. It just probably didn't have enough flow through it. Greenfield designed the first Greenfield filter, which was a conical design in 1973. This was almost a 30 French sheath. Percutaneous insertion first occurred in 1984, and then they developed a titanium and then a steel version in the late 80s, early 90s. The bird's nest was developed in 1982. This was indicated for IVCs that are up to 40 millimeters. That being said, you could make the argument that somebody who has an IVC that's 40, it may just be better to put in 2 filters, one in each iliac, than to put one bird's nest in, because these are not easy to remove. There's been case reports of these coming out, but they're not one of the easier filters to remove. It's also really bad if you're going to get an MRI. This was the first nitinol filter that was developed in 1990. This is the nitinol, and you see these occasionally. This is made by Bard. Most of their filters now are, or actually all of their filters now are temporary filters. This was considered a permanent filter. But as you'll see later, even permanent filters, particularly the Greenfield and maybe even the Venatech, even though they're considered permanent filters, are sometimes easier to remove than some of the temporary filters, depending on where they're located. And the reason for that is just because some of them have a lot of issues with tilt or fracture, or the hook being embedded in the wall. And if the hook is embedded in the wall, it's basically converted from a temporary into a permanent filter design. So this is a graphical depiction of what we have on the market today, but I sort of like this one better because these are all of the currently FDA approved filters that you can buy and deploy now. All the way at the bottom is the Venatech Convertible, which I'll show in a second. The ALN filter was developed in 1997. The idea here was that it was pretty easy to get this out, and the ALN filter actually came with an ALN removal kit, which you can see here, which is like a cone, very similar to the barred recovery cone that was available. Then they decided that it'd probably be a good idea to put a hook on it, which they did, and then that was the end of that design. The barred filters after 1990, it was 13 years, and the first retrieval indication, which was 2003, was the barred recovery filter. This was followed up by extensive redesign, so G2, G2X, Eclipse, Meridian, and then Denali, which is the one we use today. The big issue with these filters, and Rahul mentioned this, is they had a high incidence, or relatively high compared to other filters, of fracture and migration. So the design changed periodically to address each one of those issues. The Denali filter, and this is just the modifications, again, different types of hooks. This is the I believe that's the Eclipse or the Meridian, and then this is a little bit more polished and less likely to fracture. When they fracture, this is what can happen. Obviously, we've seen these cases already in the lung and the heart. Not easy to remove these tines, and lawyers really love that. Migration to the heart, but it may not make it all the way to the heart. This was one where we actually found it in the hepatic vein. And this can be removed. Luckily, it's not in the heart, and so you can remove this. Not easy to remove, but it's definitely removable. And then if you think about the data based on the Denali's clinical study, a lot of these complications were minimized with the newer iteration of the filter. So the Denali seems to be the better design of these filters. The Tulip was the first optional filter made by Cook. It was best suited for short-term retrieval. It had barbed anchors on the bottom. This was followed up in 2007 by the Celect filter, which had an early version and then a later version. This filter seemed to center better, or at least that was the goal, but it did seem to have more cable penetration. And there's been papers written about this. Dr. Durek down at Memorial Sloan Kettering looked at this, and the Select seems to penetrate the cava more. Maybe not always a symptomatic patient, but these patients typically demonstrated more caval penetration. So this may have some implication to how you would remove it. Rahul talked about the Trapease. This has distal hooks to prevent migration, but it can occlude the cava. And these filters, and this is just the optional version of it, had a higher IVC thrombosis rate. This is the Optease that was developed in 2000, or FDA approved in 2000. This also has a brachial delivery catheter. And this is just an example how you would potentially remove it using the hook from the femoral approach. This filter is not available. This is the old SafeFlow filter. No legs or hooks, and so this allowed it to sit better within the IVC, but this is not something that you can use. You may see this in certain patients if you do scans. And then the Argon filter, which was first developed in 2009, and now we have the Option Elite, has that over-the-wire delivery, a very low profile, and a lot easier to snare. This is the one we took out earlier today. I like this filter. I think it's easier to remove in many cases if it's a snare removal, but if you're going to remove it with a grasper, it's not so easy to remove this from a jugular approach as you saw earlier. And we like to take these out sometimes if they're tilted using a femoral approach, which we can talk about another time. Venatech filters, this was the permanent filter that I used to use when I was training. And I like this because it had a nice, easy deployment, femoral or jugular. And this was the newer design, which is still available today. And you can also deploy this through the arm. In 2010, the FDA issued this recommendation. This was basically their warning, and this was based on a lot of data that they had available to them at the time, that if a patient has a retrievable filter, it should be removed based on the individual risk-benefit. And if you know somebody has a filter, you should refer the patient for filter removal. In 2013, Tom Fogarty developed a self-centering double helix filter, which was bidirectional retrievable. And this company was ultimately acquired by Volcano, which was acquired by Philips, and then now this is not currently available, but you will see this in certain patients. So the ideal filter includes all of these different characteristics, and the problem is that none of these characteristics really exist in any of the filters that we have. You may get a couple of them, but these are sort of the optimal things that we look for in filters. And so what are we really doing now? Well, the Venatech Convertible is available, and this is a Venatech filter, but the middle piece is removable via snare, but it's a second procedure. So you can pull that middle part out, and you're basically left with almost like a Z-stent inside the cava, which presumably would allow more flow. There's also the Novate Medical bioabsorbable platform, which allows you to and not have to go back and remove the center portion. This will resolve on its own. It's partially bioabsorbable in 60 days. And then lastly, the bioabsorbable platform, which is completely bioabsorbable, which is being studied now in animals and now in clinical trials, I believe in Mexico. And this hopefully will be available at some point in the US, which is completely bioabsorbable within 60 days. This will allow us to put these filters in and not have to worry about removing them. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was the Angel catheter. And this is really a great option for people who are in the ICU, temporary, basically a central line and an IVC filter in one. It's all attached, and so you don't have to repuncture and have to worry about not being able to grab the filter. It's all attached to the central catheter, and this is FDA approved. And when you Google IVC filter, the first 5 things that come up are lawsuits, and if you look at the questions down there at the bottom, these are questions that people are typing into Google just to make everybody aware. And we showed a couple of these grasper removal techniques earlier, so I'm not going to go over this in detail, but you can see this is just an example of removing a option filter from the groin, and this is an example of removing an Optease filter using a double grasper technique. We mentioned the PRESERVE trial. This is 7 manufacturers, 2,100 patients, follow up to 3 months. So in summary, all filters are potentially retrievable, even permanent filters. Some are easier than others depending on where they are and how they're located. But the most important thing is don't place a filter without a plan for removal. Thank you.